guy says, I'm not a Nazi. I still like the picture. Okay. Where are we finishing it?
Oligarchies and the E4s.
Oligarchies, E4s. Oh yeah, we're still military rule, okay. So we'll do a little bit of Sparta, then we will get to the Battle of Marathon. I just want to show it. And so we got to this in Sparta. And what were the slaves called? The people they conquered and
Helots?
Yeah.
Helots?
Helots. So they just treated horrifically bad. Awful. And we talked about oligarchy, and this was the weird twin king thing. Okay. Did we get to this? I think this is right when the bell rang, wasn't it? So military rule. And the Spartans had military rule because the whole society was based upon defending themselves from the Helot rebellion. And I'm just making sure this is all broadcasting. It appears to be broadcasting. Yay! Good. And so at 2, they lived in dorms. Men and women lived separately. And they were, I'm about to say the most Spartan lifestyle, but if you ever heard that used as an adjective, it comes from this. Just a little bit of food, just barely enough to survive. The whole idea was to toughen them up. And then at age 12, they'd have to begin to defend for themselves. They would be given nothing but a cloak and sent off, and they would sleep outside no matter what the weather is, given virtually no food except for this weird thing they would eat called black broth, which they would bring with them when they fought. And the black broth was this combination of various pig innards, so the sweetmeats. Do we know what I mean when I say the sweetmeats? Yeah, the intestine, the pancreas, the heart, all brought together, mixed in with blood and lots of salt. And this black broth is what they would eat in battle. High in protein. I bet it sounds yummy. Do you want a black broth day? Who has pig innards? Okay, moving on. And they would also be given an older mentor. And the whole idea was, as this man, they would fight next to. This is from the 1961 classic 300 Spartans. But they have an older mentor so a man who would be like in his 30s, and a boy in his 12, 13, 14. And the idea was they would be side by side, they would fight together, and they wanted an incredibly close relationship with each other. And remember, men and women are separate. I'll let you go from there. But it's pretty horrible, if you think about the implications of that. But that's what they did. The whole idea was they would fight harder if they were next to somebody like that. And then at 16, they were sent out in the woods, everything taken away, and they were told to live like a wolf. And they were they were given nothing. They would steal. They were, in fact, encouraged to steal from helots and even kill them. They were encouraged to do this. Yet, if they were caught, they would be beaten, sometimes to death. So I want you to ponder this for a second. They're encouraged to do it, and if they're caught doing what they're encouraged to do, they're beaten to death. But the whole idea was, if you survive this, then you're ready to be part of this great military. And one more thing, the mentor would help them find a wife. And so they would find a wife, and they'd be apart from the wife most of the time, and eventually when they get older, they could be together. But I think part of the reason is because the mentor would be gone, and then the older would have a wife and then have a mentee. It's really very odd. Yeah.
Was this successful?
To create a military state, yeah. I mean, it was basically, it survived because of brutal slavery and this absolute conviction that everybody's out to get them. And so if you can convince everybody that they're out to get you, the idea is we have no choice but to make these sacrifices. And then after a generation or two, that became the norm. And people who didn't act that way we considered to be very odd. But there's something about that the Spartans really could not deal with other people. They had a hard time communicating and understanding. Because remember, they got rid of their money, their trade was totally different, their entire lifestyle was different than virtually every city-state. And that's why, in the long run, Athens would be significantly more dynamic. Yet, Spartan had the great military advantage. It's hard to get past what we call the shields, or the
Phalanx?
shield shoulder to shoulder, 8x8, the phalanx, yeah. Lots of Felix. The Felix. So,
Phoenix.
and it's no coincidence at the same time, and partially out of Spartan rule, would become the Olympic Games. 778, these cities, as an effort to try to come together, would have Olympics, and the Spartans were the first one to actually do the events naked. And pretty soon, all the Olympic events were naked. They're men and women. And boxing, they wrapped their wrists, and sometimes they were allowed to put metal here when they boxed. That's how we used to fight in Miles City, I'll tell you what. Growing up as a kid there, you guys couldn't. I mean, no offense. But, and you had to either submit or be knocked cold. And Spartans would never submit, because it was such a humiliating thing, that they soon quit, they refused to ever box at the Olympics. Because they couldn't admit defeat. But there's wrestling. Pancration is some kind of weird wrestling. Chariot races, a few other things, chess. No, I made that part up. This is supposed to be the long drum. Yeah, they're supposed to hold weights as they ran, hold something heavy. And yeah, they all participated in naked. It would be at the end of the 19th century that they would bring back the Olympic Games, showing that the world now has become civilized and the countries can come together for this great game. And the 20th century would be nothing but a time of peace and civilization. Okay, and then the first Olympic Games to be canceled would be during World War I. Okay, so this is just a vase of the Olympics, and you see the weights? I just thought that was kind of cool. And that's how we have to graduate. I just heard that. You have to do bull leaping and jumping with weights.
Required classes.
Athens. That is Athens right there. So while Sparta is growing into this military state, north of the Peloponnesian Peninsula is Attica, and that is Athens. Now this is Athens, obviously. This is a drawing of Athens. This is actually during the Roman Emperor Trajan. But Athens, you can see, what do we call the center spot?
Parthenon.
Well, the Parthenon's there, but what do we call the center fortified area? Every polis had it. Poli had it.
Acropolis.
Yeah, the Acropolis. Right here is that market area.
Forum.
Yeah, and that's the Romans will call a forum. You ever get a chance to go to Rome, the Roman Forum is amazing. So, in Attica, it was this great walled city. Soon the walls would be absolutely spectacular. And this is still part of the walls that's being excavated. Look at those walls. And so Athens would never have the land army that Sparta had, but walls, and they had a powerful fleet. They would become kind of the leaders of Athens until they would make or leaders of Rome, and did I say Rome? Greece. So they made a whole series of mistakes. But this is what the town looked like. Temple of Zeus, the Acropolis, other statues. It's a pretty amazing place. The Parthenon would probably be the most famous of these monuments inside the Acropolis. We'll come back and talk about the Parthenon, but I'm not going to talk about it much here because I think in Ancient Area and the Empire, Ancient Area and the Empire have a little bit about it, so I'll save that till then. But where did they get the technology to build the columns from?
Egypt.
Yeah, from Egypt. Mm-hmm.
So for the last slide,
Yeah.
what's the difference between Attica and Athens?
Oh, Attica is the region around it.
Okay.
So Athens is just the city. Good question. And remember, Attica was the place that survived after the Mycenaean collapse and the Dorian invasion. And so Attica, it gave Athens the feeling we are the center of Greece. They would lose it in the Peloponnesian War, the mistakes they would make. Oh, and plague. Plague! It's plague season again.
Once a century.
Hey, I hope it comes more like the superstorms. And who just caught the plague?
President Trump and the
Yeah.
First Lady.
And other people.
Well, no.
Yeah, now a couple senators, and it appears as though it was super spreader events. And one thing that's happened right now, even though over 200,000 people have died in the United States alone, a lot of young people had it, and they might get really sick, but there's a less chance that they're going to have the pre-existing conditions. As you get older, it happens. Trust me, I know. But these are all people that are pretty old. They're not telling much, but President Trump is having major symptoms. I don't know what that means. So let's just put it this way, the next 5 weeks are going to be amazing. You know, when I was a kid, growing up, we just had to deal with the Soviet Union and stuff. You guys got pandemics, you got, the glaciers are disappearing, Greenland is melting, you get forest fires, you get economic disaster, you get the rise of fascism. I envy you. Okay, I'm being facetious. Yeah.
So I have a theory that Russia, they know they lost the Cold War, right? Or like we won the Cold War.
You and I, yeah.
Besides the outright war, they're now doing subtle biological warfare.
It's so obvious.
Through China. They're using China as a scapegoat.
Yeah, there's a myth going around that China somehow gave President Trump this disease, and I'm thinking you guys are okay.
They gave everyone else the disease.
I don't think they didn't mean to. But Athens would eventually have walls from Athens to Piraeus, which was their harbor city. And before you ask the question, I'll tell you, why didn't they just build Athens on the harbor? Well, remember the sea people, those pirates from the Iron Age. They're worried about attacks, so they want to go over the hill where they could defend. But they would eventually have, it's unreal what Athens would do. They had a walled city, and then they walled the road all the way to the harbor. About 10 miles of walls. And so they could be resupplied and keep a powerful fleet here and still keep Athens. So while Sparta had the soldiers, Athens had the walls and the navy. We'll come to that in a little bit later. But just a couple more minutes and then we're going to watch Marathon. So Athens began to build. There's another picture of the long wall. I like this one. From the harbor up into the hills. Think of the organization that had to have. I mean, this was an incredible state. So, yeah.
How did they build them? Was that like slaves or?
Slaves and laborers, yes.
Okay.
So Athens would have a democracy with slaves. Gee, does that sound like a country? I'm trying to think. Okay, yeah.
Does Athens touch the coast today? Because I know it's expanded a lot, but have they...
Yeah, it pretty much does. It's all people to the coast.
Okay.
It's a massive city. I think like 3.5 million or 4 million.
Yeah, something.
That's bigger than Helena.
Wait, seriously?
That's bigger than Montana.
Yeah, only 4 times. Okay.
And
so,
Wyoming. And Idaho.
Well, Athens going into the same time Sparta is just beginning. Athens is starting, same kind of deal. Limited farmland, small farmers. But a little like Sparta too, vast inequalities between the rich and the poor are taking over. And they have an oligarchy. We know what oligarchy is, ruled by a few. Anybody know what a tyrant was at that time? We think a tyrant is like a dictatorial leader who rules with an iron fist. Does that make sense? You think a tyrant. You think of me, you think tyrant, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But what is a tyrant? At that time, a tyrant is just somebody who holds all power. So it doesn't mean they necessarily are an evil leader, but they are the ultimate power, what we would eventually call a dictator. So a tyrant was more of a method of how they have power. It is not actually how they lead. Now today, if you say they're a tyrant, we think of people like Mussolini or Saddam Hussein or somebody's a tyrant. Or King George III, even though it wasn't quite. Well, the system was rigged against poor farmers, who made up the vast majority of the population. And it looked like there was a series of rebellions. And the tyrant Draco took power. Now, Draco would begin to organize. In fact, he's going to be called the lawgiver. That's Draco right there. He would change the tyrant, this leader, into a position called the archon, which we've seen before, which was a 1-year leadership position. 1 year. So the point about that is they don't have constant power. They rotate. We're not yet to it. It's literally going to be the democracy. But one leader. And he also set up a series of very stiff laws to dictate how the people of Athens operated, to crack down because the poor in Athens were beginning to rebel. In fact, what is named after Draco and these laws that would brutally punish and torture with branding and removing the fingernails and fingers and eyeballs. That's where you get draconian from. You heard that term draconian? From Draco. And he'll be called the lawgiver. He's really a pretty horrible person. But the peasants were going into huge amount of debt. They were horrible debt. And they're beginning to call what's called debt peonage, which should sound familiar today, where people are in so much debt that they become slaves to the people who own their debt. They would lose their land and become slaves, and literally you would have debt slavery. And so the vast number of people in Greece, in Athens, had gone from being small farmers to being virtual slaves because of debt. And the part that Draco made that's so important, his draconian rule was, you must pay back your debts. Remember coins? Coins were just starting to be used, and they wanted the coins. On that happy note, okay, so the Persians and the Greeks are going to go to war. I want to show that today, so we're going to watch it right now. So, we got to go backtrack just a little bit, but we are going to watch. We're going to watch the Battle Marathon, but we got to transfer to teams. So everybody on the YouTube, we're going to teams. Yes.